There is a women's silver ring that got left in the ladies' restroom. Did you find it? Has it been found? Do I need to, am I stopping? Anyway, if there is not a ring on your finger that used to be there, check the restroom. That was a weird announcement. Anyway, thank you for coming back. We've got 2 more agenda items, and so we'll start first with Sarah Edmonds from PGE to give an update on the EIM conversations.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm here representing the EIM entities that are part of the work to explore an extended day-ahead market, or EDAM, as it's affectionately been referred to for about the last 18 months or so. So I'm going to start off right off the bat and say, spoiler alert, we're not finished yet. But we're getting closer to completing our feasibility assessment, which is something we've talked about over the last year or so, the work that the EIM entities with implementation agreements have been doing to look at the viability and the feasibility of whether it makes sense to move forward with extended day-ahead market. So let me just sort of reaffirm why it is that we organized ourselves in this manner. I think it's been referred to already a couple of times today about past efforts to set up markets in the West and how those have been challenged and challenging in the last 20 years or so. And I would definitely acknowledge that within the EIM entity community, there's a number of us that have been involved in one way or another in one of those myriad efforts over the last couple decades. And with that comes quite a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder, from being essentially sort of relegated to airport conference rooms for years on end with the hopes of setting up a very bright and brilliant market, only to find that sort of the thing falls apart on you. And I would say that is our primary driver in terms of why EIM entities would coordinate with one another to look at, do we think this thing has enough potential to merit the dedication of time and resources that it will inevitably take. Obviously, there's the market design process itself, and if you look back at energy imbalance market just as a point of reference for what does it take to essentially design a market that doesn't really exist in any exact form that's parallel to this, I'm sure someone from CAISO will fact check me if I'm wrong, but I want to say it took at least a year, if not a year and a half, to go through that process, EIM market design, quite significant in and of itself. And then on top of that, you have the inevitable regulatory processes. You know, of course, one of the strategic approaches in going for incremental market optimization, absent turning over, full control of transmission assets to a market operator, an RTO or an ISO, is you avoid triggering a lot of the statutory obligations to get authorization from your state public utility commissions. That's kind of one of the nifty attributes of just going after market optimization and not the other components of a full regional ISO. Nevertheless, many jurisdictions require some kind of process, and there will inevitably be costs that regulated utilities will eventually seek recovery for. And so whether you want to avoid it or not, I would anticipate in the future, if EIM entities do go forward with EIM, there will be regulatory process in some corner in the West with states or other, regulatory bodies. And then, lest we forget, there's always the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that has a lot of opinions, probably, about what this market design should look like. And does it stand up to muster, especially given what will probably be many of its unique features, just a day-ahead market optimization? What process will FERC entail? So you put that all together, and you're looking at a pretty significant mountain of work. And again, for that reason, we really wanted to take a look for ourselves, for our own due diligence, to really validate whether or not we were ready to go in on this thing, whether it made sense. And our best idea for doing that is the feasibility assessment that we've referred to from time to time over the last many months. We are getting much closer to being finished with that work, but I have no big announcement today about the completion of that. In the past, we have said, our hope is to be done Q3 of this year, and we are sitting right smack dab in Q3, and I'm not going to vary from that. I'm going to stay there, but I also am not giving you an update, so you take the over-under on that one. But I also wanted to kind of provide a couple of thoughts about framing this thing. If this works out and we decide we're going to go forward, presumably we're going to discuss what those results look like, and then we're going to talk about what comes next. And I really want to emphasize that although I don't know the disposition of all of that work yet, what comes next is really the focus. And we've explained this many times over the last long time of months and weeks, that this is really all about ultimately the future stakeholder process. We acknowledge that the EIM entities have gathered and have coordinated, and we're doing that to kind of do our own due diligence, but we fully recognize and fully anticipate that actual EDAM market design happens in the stakeholder process. We do not take that for granted, and we realize that there is some inefficiency then in the way that we have organized our work. And what I mean by that is if we've taken all this time to look at a feasibility assessment to determine whether we move forward, but we're also acknowledging that market design may likely change from what we have conceived it or what we would like it to be, we're necessarily going to have to look again at what the benefits are. And that is really the basis for a decision of any EIM entity in the future to decide whether to join an EDAM if that goes forward. It's not the feasibility assessment work that this group is looking at today. I describe that as a due diligence exercise. The real focus is what comes next. I'm hopeful that what comes next is that robust stakeholder process where many different areas of market design will be the focus and where the entire region will be invited to participate in that, and that will be kicked off as CAISO stakeholder processes typically are with issue papers and comments, and you've probably been through it before with discrete market design initiatives from CAISO, but I would also sort of give you a heads up that this is going to be kind of the mother of stakeholder processes in a sense like EIM was, where you have to tackle half a dozen key issues to get the market design off the ground. And so it's also my opportunity to kind of say, if this thing moves forward, everyone should understand that that is a significant commitment not only of EIM entity resources, but really of any entity that seeks to follow and participate in the process. So that is my set of comments. That is my update. And I would love to take any questions. I bet Jennifer has one.
Great. I get called out. That's wonderful. Hi, Sarah. This is Jennifer Gardner again with Western Resource Advocate. So let's see. I do have a couple of questions, but I think maybe I'll start off with hopefully what I think is a straightforward question. I know as this process has been going on, and I realize you guys have been working on the feasibility assessment, certain assumptions that need to go into that feasibility assessment to determine if this is worth moving forward with or not. Some of those assumptions will be tied to market design, which, again, we'll be addressing in the stakeholder process. My question for you is whether, as it's currently conceived, whether EDAM is simply going to be an energy services only market, or whether you envision ancillary services as well being included in market design. And if you cannot answer that question, I do have a backup question.
Oh, here. Two-parters. Okay. The feasibility assessment is pretty discrete. It needed to be. It's already taken us a long time, and I acknowledge that it's taken us longer than, that wasn't me, that it's taken us longer than we originally messaged. So I think my answer to your question is we've probably streamlined some complexity in order to get through it. But then the second part is if stakeholders believe that that is an essential piece of an effective day-ahead market, then that is exactly what will be brought out through the issuance of papers and the ability of stakeholders to talk about what's important to them and what they think should be. Yeah, Laura.
Laura Trelease with Public Generating Pool. So CAISO is undergoing a pretty significant initiative with the day-ahead market enhancements that has would, I'm assuming, have a pretty large impact on benefits and feasibility, and just curious how that's being looked at by the EIM entities and what the crossover there is.
I invite other EIM entities who may be in the room and who may have strong opinions on this matter to speak up, but I will sort of speak from kind of a high-level vantage point and maybe sort of laced with my own sort of personal view, Laura. I understand what I have heard out there in the stakeholder community, that day-ahead market enhancements, or DAME, are sort of like no regrets, foundational day-ahead fixtures, and that's why they've launched. And I get that, I do. But I also would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that moving too far with foundational day-ahead design frameworks could become problematic when you don't know what else might be coming. And again, the EIM entities are going to have viewpoints, but that is a pretty decent slice of the pie, but it's not the only one. And there'll be other complexity that's introduced. And so I personally think the area should be looked at with a lot of caution.
I have a follow-up to Jennifer's question, just to be sure I understood your answer, which was, Jennifer's question was energy only or energy and ancillary services. I think I understood you to say you streamlined for feasibility purposes, which I interpret that to mean you looked at energy only at this point. Is that
I mean, really focusing on the unit commitment savings that come with the day-ahead sort of add-on. So, yes. That's not to say that conversations have not occurred within that group about what might be beneficial and what should be looked at, but I probably am going to stop there because, again, we have a commitment one to the other to kind of keep that work in the circle until we're ready to go with it. We're not ready, but we are getting much closer.
Okay. And then I do another follow-up. You talked about Q3, and you're gonna hold to Q3.
I am holding to Q3 that will be finished in Q3.
Okay.
I can't commit about when a stakeholder process gets kicked off, and I'm getting a nod from Stacy, so I'm feeling better about that. Dawn's giving me a smile, so I feel like, okay, that's pretty good.
Well, when you say finished, does that mean out in the public sphere?
I think what it means is I'm not going to get off of the prior messaging, which is we anticipated being done in Q3 with our decision about whether we're moving forward or not. So I am not tipping my hat one way or the other about is the decision that we think there is promise there and we should go, or did we see some issues and, you know, that's another direction.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Hey, Jennifer, what do you got?
All right, so now I'm going to follow up to Teresa's question. It sounds like the timing is really important to a lot of stakeholders when you guys will have an answer on whether you'll move forward or not. And so my question is, with the feasibility assessment results, are you planning to release those results publicly? And if so, to what degree or to what sort of level of granularity can we expect results? I know there are a lot of folks who are interested to see something, and so I'm curious what the plans are from the EIM entities.
You know, still very much under discussion, so I will have to give you a non-answer, Jennifer, but I would say this, and this is my perspective. I realize that we have been talking about the feasibility assessment for a very long time, and also realize through your outreach, Jennifer, and your constituents that is a very important component, which is what will we learn from it, what can we take from it as we move forward, regardless of which direction the EIM entities move. So I would say that I hear you, and I try to convey that interest back to the group when we have the discussions. Yeah, Fred.
Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. So first is just a quick comment, which is, yes, the schedule is already crowded and going to get a lot more crowded. Yep. Just to name two that are of concern for us in the Northwest, the Northwest Power Pool is doing a big resource adequacy thing. I'm not exactly sure what to call it yet. They have an October 2 big kind of public unveiling on what they've been doing. I think a lot of us are both hopeful and concerned about that process. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council is just getting geared up for their 2021 plan. They've Fish and Wildlife addendum is out for public hearings now, so they're now really gearing up to get the modeling done. They do a 5-year planning cycle where, again, resource adequacy, given coal retirements and the shift in public policies and, shift toward clean resources, which we, of course, are very supportive of, all that's on the table. I think that's going to provide a boost to the prospects for the EDAM. But there's no question the schedule is complicated. I'm looking at the new CAISO proposed stakeholder initiative documents here. I got the chart showing all the different ones. And just to give one example, the extend day-ahead market enhancements to EIM entities, not the same thing, listed as starting in Q1 of 2020 and, keeps going. So that one obviously relates to the EDAM, but is not the EDAM itself. So I'm wondering how all this can come together, and given the very, very busy schedule that we've already got, your thinking or the thinking of the other EIM entities and, of course, the ISO about how long the EDAM stakeholder process could take, realizing that, yes, it could extend, it often does. And I want to underscore my view, anyway, that we've got to get this right, that we can't force a result, and if it takes 6 months or a year longer than we think, I don't want to allow for that, but if it happens, so be it, because we have to get this right. So any thoughts about how the schedule and the content of that stakeholder process is being discussed, and at what point you think, once the assessment is released, that we can actually start seeing some proposals about what the content and what the structure and what the timeline will be for the stakeholder process.
I welcome my friends from CAISO to weigh in if they would like to. I think my earlier comment about how long EIM market design took is instructive. So it's maybe worth going back and looking at that. But I'd also observe that there were far fewer participants in that market design process because a lot of folks were involved in the Northwest Power Pool MC effort. So I think with more stakeholders brings a more diversity of viewpoints, more complexity, potentially more time. I am also, I guess I would say the EIM entity community is very aware of all of the activity in the region on a number of fronts. It's really interesting and fascinating to me that, we've got in the one corner, we've got this drive to find market efficiencies and to find that value, especially given the pressures on our system with integration and retirements and everything else. In the other corner, you have vigorous activity around resource adequacy, both in California and for the Northwest region, moving at a pace that's pretty breathtaking. And I think also, to me, interestingly, you have an effort to integrate and combine very large regional transmission planning footprints. So you kind of have all these elements that are sort of the traditional, I call it the three-legged stool of the RTO, and they're all sort of going on in different quadrants, but kind of all of the activity is interestingly converging right about now. And how to support all of that and move it forward, Fred, I would say it's significant. I have a lot of discussion with my team at PGE about how we're going to stand this up and how we're going to move forward with it and how we're going to cover it all. It is significant, but I guess what I'm saying is I don't think that it's a coincidence that all those things are happening. They're all needs and they sort of represent very much a changing environment in our region. So I don't have a good answer for you. I know EIM entities have had a lot of benefit and a lot of efficiency in working together and kind of covering the field through a more coalition approach, and I know that is an idea that we continue to have as we think about how to tackle the work that's ahead.
Well, I actually think that is a good answer, and the reason is I think it's important to recognize that we have to really think clearly about the path forward and all the factors that are involved, and not just simply say, you know, yeah, it'll get done, or no, you know, it'll just get delayed. There's going to have to be an intentional engagement by everybody to make this work.
I agree, Fred. I also think, though, that there is a balance between what you just said, and on the one end, analysis paralysis, and on the other, moving too quickly, right? So sometimes time can create opportunities for the effort to falter or fall on its own weight, and we're very keen to ensure that doesn't happen. But we also agree, EIM entities absolutely agree with you that we have to do this right and we shouldn't rush it just to get it off the ground. But we should be keeping an eye towards what additional incremental value can we deliver to our customers within a commercially reasonable time frame. And when I say commercially reasonable, I'm saying that sort of in the context of what it takes this region to get big off the ground.
Are there any questions on the phone for Sarah?
Just a reminder, if you want to enter the queue, please press #2.
Any other questions in the room? Well, so we'll look forward to having a different kind of update at the November Regional Issues Forum meeting.
Who knows? I'll take your bets in the back.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, we're going to transition now to a panel discussion on system market power analysis. And I want to set up a couple of things about this panel. So first, this is one of the things we like to do in the Regional Issues Forum, which is talk about issues that aren't formally in a stakeholder process yet. However, there have been a couple of workshops, or there's at least been one workshop on this issue. So there is kind of some history and some presentations and comments that have been filed on this, but there isn't a formal stakeholder process. So we thought this was a good time to bring it here, kind of highlight what the issue is. That's why we've noted it as an informational update. We're not necessarily trying to want to understand the issue and specifically how the issue might connect to the EIM or to the real-time markets. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this is an issue that's got a lot of different perspectives about it. And so similar to what we found in some of the panels during the carbon workshop, I think we're going to hear really different perspectives today, and we kind of encourage you to ask questions and really understand each of the different panelists' perspectives. So we are going to start with Perry from the California ISO, and then I'm going to go ahead and allow some questions after each presentation, but we might limit the questions after each presentation to make sure we get through all of them. And so Perry's going to provide an overview of the issue, kind of the origin of the issue itself, and then a little bit of context before we move into some of the individual perspectives. And Nikki, I'm looking at the slides, whether we have the slides set up. Great. Oh, and I have this. Terrific. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Perry Servideo, a lead market design policy developer at the California ISO. I'm sitting here with three people I've never met before, Callie, Jeff, and Partha, to talk about our current favorite topic. So the ISO, we recently completed an analysis of structural competitiveness in the CAISO's day-ahead market. And here I'd like to talk about those results and what they mean going forward. So we track various metrics as indicators to whether our day-ahead market supply mix and supply participation are competitive. And metrics indicates small but growing instances of potentially uncompetitive conditions in our day-ahead market. We've been working with stakeholders in the Market Surveillance Committee to better understand the root causes, the implications of these metrics, as well as the implications of potential market design changes that we can make to mitigate the concerns. So while the process is heading towards potential policy development, we don't anticipate changes to the existing EIM market power mitigation design. We're evaluating whether it would be appropriate to apply a system-level market power mitigation to the CAISO balancing authority area. And you could recall that energy imbalance market balancing areas outside of the California ISO are already subject to a system-level market power mitigation screen. And these screens assume first that the CAISO energy price is a competitive price. So this is, as a reminder, when an EIM balancing authority area is import constrained, system-level market power mitigation is applied to that EIM balancing authority area. And that means that resources within that EIM balancing authority area are mitigated to the greater of their default energy bid or our competitive price. So that's kind of the linkage here. There are standard tests to measure the potential competitiveness of the market, which I'll talk about in the next couple slides. But first, at a high level, what is it and what are we on the lookout for, and why does it matter? So when market conditions are structurally uncompetitive, suppliers may be able to exercise market power and raise energy prices by withholding supply from the market. They would do this by offering supply to the market above their marginal costs. And our current design has checks in place to mitigate potential economic withholding during uncompetitive conditions. Like I said before, the EIM areas have a check on their balancing authority areas, and the CAISO currently has a local market power mitigation check on constraints internal to the CAISO. We do not have a BA-level system market power check currently. So we're on the lookout for if there's a rise in potential uncompetitive conditions, and we're trying to see what do we do about it. So one measure of structural competitiveness is the residual supply index. And this is actually a pretty simple test. You just check to see if the supply not offered by the three largest suppliers is enough to serve demand. Can your non-pivotal supply serve your demand? The residual supply index that we calculated for our analysis earlier this year for the day-ahead market indicated the CAISO balancing area may have been structurally uncompetitive in 201 hours in 2018. And that's this chart you're looking at here just shows which hours these RSI test failures occurred in and how many failures occurred in those hours. So across the bottom you have the 24 hours a day, and up the y-axis you have the number of hours failed in, that were found to be structurally uncompetitive in this RSI test. So this, to some people, came as no surprise. These are hours when our net load peak these are our net load peak hours when supply is extremely tight. We have the solar coming off the system, and we need to bring in a lot of power to manage that. And these results are consistent with our reliability analysis that show reserve margins in these hours can be tight because we're using nearly all of our available generation to ramp up we're using all of our internal generation to ramp up to meet the demand. And I'll also note here that this condition is a bit different from what California saw in 2000-2001 when supply was tight throughout the day. Here we have a concentrated number of hours a day in which supply is extremely. Price cost markups. So another measure of structural competitiveness is an aftermarket price cost markup calculation. And this compares energy prices resulting from our estimate of marginal costs base offers and it compares energy prices resulting from our estimate of marginal cost base offers and energy prices resulting from the actual offers that we received in the day-ahead market. So where this metric shows a markup, it indicates suppliers could have meaningfully raised energy prices by bidding above marginal cost. What you're seeing here is across the bottom the number of hours that we saw these markups, and these markups are on the y-axis. So you can see 1 hour had, we had a calculation of $120 markup, and it falls from there. The key takeaway here is that in about 20 hours, we saw these greater than $20 per megawatt hour markup, and that it grew from 2017 to 2018. We have a couple other considerations, and I think some of the other panelists are going to talk about even more other considerations. What we want to show in this chart is that our high prices are correlated with tight supply. As our reserve margins fall, the amount of generation being offered into our day-ahead market, as that falls, you see prices go up. This also is not a surprise. So these hours with low reserve margins, generally the same hours, the low reserve margin hours that you see towards the left side of this chart are generally the same hours of our peak net load that you saw in the previous slides. And that happens again as solar output decreases, and that's also when we see the RSI tests fail. So prices increase with low reserve margin because the market has to move all the way up the supply bid curve and dispatch the highest price supply. In addition, there's another consideration here. If supply is tight throughout the WECC, importers typically bid higher because load throughout the West is bidding for the same supply. They have a slightly different incentive than our internal generators in the day-ahead market because they don't have to consider the opportunity cost, or they have to consider the opportunity cost of selling to someone else other than the California ISO. Another consideration that we have is how our day-ahead market prices correlate with high natural gas prices and high load levels. Another not surprising chart here, as you have higher gas costs indicated with the size of the bubble, you see higher prices. As you see higher load levels in the California ISO day-ahead market, you see higher prices. So in summary, what I'm trying to show in the past few slides is that while our structural test is failing and we're seeing more instances of high price cost markups, we're being cautious, trying to tease out the scarcity indicators from true exercise of market power in the day-ahead market. And just process update, I know a lot of people here are interested in process. We plan to continue the discussions on the appropriate response with our stakeholders. And with the Market Surveillance Committee, we're planning a September working group meeting, and there will be an October Market Surveillance Committee meeting. After that, the Market Surveillance Committee is preparing a written opinion on what measures should be taken to address system market power, and they plan to present that to the CAISO Board of Governors at the November Board of Governors meeting.
Thank you.
I could take questions, or we could go to Callie's next.
Yes, Callie is next. Let's take if there are questions of clarification on the material that Perry's presented.
Clay MacArthur with Deseret Power. Just a quick clarification. Are you saying that this is isolated to the day-ahead market, or are you saying that this is existing or similar conditions exist in all terms?
The analysis that we did in the first quarter of this year was focused on day-ahead market.
Laura Trelease, Public Generating Pool. I've been following these discussions, but remind me in your analysis how often there were import constraints during the times that you were seeing some of the other, when all of these other screens that were happening with tight supply and RSI and all that.
Right. So we don't have that published, and actually we're working on that data right now. And I think maybe Jeff will talk a little bit about that in slides.
Ramon Mitchell with Pacific Corp here. So if you could go back to slide 7, I just have a quick clarifying question there. If I look at slide 7 without putting much thought into it, that green vertical line there would indicate that you have more demand than supply, which obviously you didn't indicate in the load shedding event. So what exactly is going into those metrics?
Right. So the day-ahead market is a social welfare maximization. So what we think is happening in those hours to the left of the 100% is we're just clearing less load in the day-ahead market. Sorry, I guess I could be a little bit more clear. The reserve margins are relative to our day-ahead forecast of demand. So you could see that we could clear an amount of load in the day-ahead market that's less than our day-ahead forecast of demand, the IFM results.
Thank you.
I think it was on one of your early slides where you suggested if there was some type of system market power mitigation, that it would not affect mitigation in EIM balancing authority areas. But what kind of impact would system market power mitigation have on real-time pricing and then the effects on the EIM?
Okay, so a lot of the design details are still up in the air, and we're working on a white paper for that. However, I think what I'm trying to show on this slide here is that if you understand that resources in the EIM area are mitigated the greater of their default energy bid or the CAISO competitive energy price, anything that we do that impacts the CAISO competitive energy price will then impact the level to which resources in the EIM are mitigated.
Thank you. And then I have one other question. I'm looking to see if others have questions. In your data where it had number of hours, like I think maybe just the next couple of slides, was that over a quarter? I think, did you say, was it first quarter of 20?
Yeah, sorry. So this was, we did the analysis in the first quarter of this year looking at all hours in 2018. So this is 8760 okay. 2018, yeah. Perfect. We saw 201 hours out of 8760 fail the structural test.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Okay. So next, we'll hear from Callie Wells, representing Western Power Trading Forum, and give perspective on this issue. There we go.
Hi, I'm Callie Wells, and I'm a senior partner at Gridwell Consulting, and I'm here today on behalf of the Western Power Trading Forum. So the Western Power Trading Forum, for those of you who don't know, is a member-based nonprofit trading organization that really focuses on encouraging market transparency and competition throughout the Western energy markets. So in addition to representing WPTF, Gridwell Consulting also does primarily work within the Western energy market. We've also done market design work for other ISOs and RTOs outside of California. So we really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and kind of fold into the discussion some of WPTF's current thoughts on system market power and the concerns that have been raised. I really want to spend this time touching on 4 main points today. The first one, Perry kind of already covered a little bit of that, but I'm really just acknowledging that the residual supply index is a tool that's used to predict uncompetitive conditions. It is not a metric that identifies hours in which market power has actually been exerted in the market. In fact, there are other conditions that also have to exist at the same time for participants to actually be able to exert market power. So in addition to an RSI, you really should be looking at some additional metrics to try and tease out which one of those hours there actually is the potential for the exercise of market power. The third point I want to talk about today is the potential implications that if we were to find ourselves on a route of mitigating for system level market power, that there could be some adverse impacts to the supply conditions we see in California today if that mitigation is not implemented, what I'm calling accurately. We'll get into that in a little bit more details in a couple of slides. But we could have essentially find ourselves in a situation where we have more worsening the supply conditions tomorrow than what we see today. And the last point is really we want to take this chance to kind of tee up some bigger picture questions and concerns that have been raised recently in some of these system market power analysis discussions, as we find that a lot of these questions or concerns have implications that extend beyond the California boundary, and so we feel that they warrant further discussion and consideration in this process. So Perry kind of already touched on what the residual supply index is, but I thought it'd be helpful to, again, recap. So the residual supply index is a very common metric that's used to try and predict uncompetitive conditions from a supplier concentration perspective. Essentially, it's a ratio. You're comparing supply to demand, but the supply that you use in that ratio is not the total supply that's being made available to the market. If you're calculating an RSI 3, for example, which is, I believe, what Perry showed in his analysis, you take that total supply, but you subtract from it the supply that's controlled by the top 3 largest suppliers. So you take the remaining supply and compare that to demand. And if that ratio is less than 1, that hour is flagged as being potentially uncompetitive. So essentially what that means is you need supply from at least one of those largest suppliers in order to meet demand. So as with several metrics, especially in the energy market, there are a lot of assumptions that you do have to make when you're calculating an RSI, and depending on where you land with these assumptions, the results can actually vary, and in some cases quite significantly. And the actual assumptions that you have to make will also differ when you're looking at calculating an RSI for the day-ahead market versus real-time market, as well as if you're calculating an RSI for system market power versus local market power. So as we continue having these conversations and as the discussions involved, it's really important that we keep in mind what the RSI is and what it is not. Again, it is a screening tool, and it can be a very effective screening tool, but it's intended to predict uncompetitive conditions from a supplier concentration perspective. Again, it's not a metric that tells you how many hours market power has actually been exercised in the market. And when we really start thinking about it at a system level market power, it might not even be that reliable of an indicator that market power could possibly be potentially be exercised. For example, one of the assumptions that you have to make is what level of imports or supply from external entities do you assume is going to be available. And if the pricing is right, the RSI doesn't account for the fact that there might be supply out there today that's not showing up in bids, but tomorrow, if you get the pricing right, it might show up. So that's, when we're talking system level market power, that's one, I guess, characteristic that the RSI doesn't necessarily capture, but is really important when we're talking about system market power. Another characteristic that the RSI has is that it tends to be a little bit more conservative, meaning it will over-identify hours as being potentially uncompetitive. For those of you who enjoy statistics, that results in those type 1 errors, false positives. And I'll get into the implications this characteristic has in the next slide, because it has some, I think, really significant implications that warrant a lot of attention. And lastly, again, there are other conditions that also have to exist for market power to be exercised in the market that the RSI does not calculate or does not, take into consideration in that formula. And I'll also touch on these in a couple slides. There we go. Okay, so one of the biggest limitations we believe the RSI index has is this tendency to be overly conservative, especially if it's used as the only screen in identifying market power. Again, it can result in these false positives or these type 1 errors quite a bit, especially during those peak net load peak hours that Perry showed on his slide. So, for example, if you take an hour and you have, I'm going to try and do math here on the fly. I'll do that idea. Let's see if I can survive. 30,000 megawatts of demand in an hour. Let's say you have supply of about 30,100 megawatts of supply. And let's say you have, I'm going to make it easy on myself, several suppliers, and they all have equal share of supply. When you go to do an RSI 3, more likely than not, you only have 100 megawatts of excess supply there. You'll end up with a ratio of less than 1, and that hour is flagged as being uncompetitive. But in the hour I just described, there was no supplier concentration concern. There's several suppliers, they all had equal share. That hour is just an hour of tight supply. But that hour would be flagged as uncompetitive, and if you then use this RSI screen as a trigger for mitigation in terms of which hours bids will actually be mitigated in the market, we could wind up mitigating offers during hours of tight supply. But yes, okay, right slide. But even if we got the RSI, let's say we got it absolutely perfect, we're not over or under identifying hours. Again, that still doesn't mean that market power can actually be exerted in the market. There's two other conditions that also have to exist for that to happen that the RSI doesn't capture. One of them is there has to be some sort of predictable trend. Market participants have to know how and when to implement a market power mitigation or a market power strategy through their bids into the market. So there's no predictable trends there. There's no way for them to know when and how to implement those market to exert market power. Additionally, those predictable uncompetitive conditions also have to be persistent. And by that I mean they have to occur for several hours or intervals in a row to make it even worthwhile for market participants to exert market power. So a market participant's not going to price themselves out of the market for the hopes of capturing a high price in 1 or 2 hours or intervals in a day. And when you start thinking about that from suppliers sitting outside of California that offer the supply into import, they're also looking at their opportunities in other markets, and oftentimes those sell in 16-hour blocks. So they're not going to forego selling a 16-hour block at $200 somewhere else, hoping that they can capture 1 or 2 hours of $1,000 prices in the ISO. Okay, so if we do find ourselves down this road where the ISO decides to implement some sort of mitigation mechanism for system market power, it is absolutely crucial that that mechanism does not degrade the quality of price signals. Accurate price signals, especially scarcity pricing, is key in a well-functioning market. It's that price signal that the market sends out to participants that then in turn will incent them to engage in more efficient actions, whether that's investments or hedging. But if we aren't mitigating appropriately and we don't allow the market to send out, for example, higher prices during tight supply conditions or near scarce conditions, the market participants aren't receiving the accurate price signal that they should be. And at the end, in the long run, what that ends up doing is the market as a whole is going to forego some sort of efficiency. And this becomes extremely important when we realize how much California relies on imports today, and that trend is only going upward last time I checked. So if those prices aren't right, especially during those tight supply conditions, the import supply that we see today, again, might not be there tomorrow. But what if we get it wrong? What if whatever mitigation strategy or mitigation mechanism that's implemented inaccurately mitigates? And by that I mean that it's mitigating prices during those hours of tight supply conditions. It's suppressing the prices. The price signals that are being sent out to the participants are saying California has plenty of supply. We don't need any extra supply. So what is that going to do? Well, for suppliers sitting outside of California and they're looking at other markets, they're going to send their supply elsewhere. They're going to get that signal that, you know, my supply is more valued in another market, so I'm going to offer it there instead of to the California ISO. And in turn, if you kind of follow down that route, you could end up in a situation where you're essentially chasing away supply from imports that California today and tomorrow relies so heavily on. So we could end up in a situation where the solution that we might consider to address this problem backfires and actually has an adverse impact that, you know, that maybe could have prevented. The second point on here is something I think is interesting to think about. You know, are there other implications at a west-wide energy market that we haven't thought of if California ISO is the only BA that mitigates for system-level power? Are suppliers that are looking at all the markets in the Western Interconnect, will this cause them to kind of shy away from even considering to offer their supply into California just because they know if they offer their supply into California, there's a chance that their bid is going to get mitigated and they could end up still having to sell their energy at a price that's below what they initially were willing to. So this slide, I'm just going to kind of leave this one up here for your own general consumption. What I really wanted to get at here is there's been a lot of recent discussion on this topic. It was one of the hot topics at the most recent Market Surveillance Committee meeting 2 weeks ago. But it really is to highlight the fact that there are some bigger picture questions and concerns that have been raised recently that we really haven't had to wrestle with yet. You know, California has always operated under the assumption that at a system level it is competitive. The Western Interconnect also operates under that same assumption. Obviously for California, we're now questioning that. So we think it's really worthwhile to spend some time and think about these bigger picture questions. Ask ourselves if there are implications to the Western-wide energy market that we haven't thought of if California ends up implementing some sort of mitigation mechanism. You know, is there a ripple effect that we really need to consider and kind of think about before we continue down this path? That is it. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to go to the next slide. But I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hi, Tony Braun. I have a question for you, Kelly. So there are obviously a lot of practical implications of supply moving around from subregion to subregion, and that's something that has existed since startup. But I mean, FERC has a just and reasonableness standard, right? And so if resulting prices from the ISO's market reflect market power and end up in unjust and unreasonable prices, how does this balancing act that you're urging really come into play with that analysis?
So if we find ourselves where some prices are unjust and unreasonable and end up implementing some sort of mitigation strategy or mechanism, again, I think it's very crucial that with that comes some sort of improvement in scarcity pricing so that during those hours of tight supply conditions, that accurate price signal is still being sent out.
Or would you go so far as to say that we should have a uniform system market power mitigation across the West in order to avoid some of these things?
I wouldn't go so far to that point yet. I think that is definitely a bigger picture question that warrants further discussion and one that I think it is definitely an interesting question to ask, but one we haven't really had to wrestle with yet.
Ramon Mitchell from Pacific Corp. I understand your issues on the residual supply index as perhaps an inappropriate measure of market power. Do you have any other alternative approaches that perhaps have been used elsewhere within the nation, or something other than the residual supply index which may be more appropriate?
So the residual supply index is, it can be a very effective screening tool. It's what the ISO uses today for local market power mitigation. I think, though, that there needs to be additional metrics layered on top of that to really try and tease out those false positives and really make sure that the hours that are being identified are, in fact, hours with uncompetitive conditions. And I think, honestly, it might just be a matter of monitoring and adding on top of it, metrics about persistency or predictability and seeing if there's a trend.
Laura Trelease with Public Generating Pool. I think what I heard Perry say is that the analysis is unclear on whether or not it shows that the high prices are a result of suppliers exerting market power. And what I heard Kelly say is to incorporate a system market power mitigation process, there could be some unintended consequences if you trigger that inappropriately. And so I know as part of this stakeholder process, or not a stakeholder process, but the discussions that have been happening, CAISO has identified several other solutions besides the system market power process, maybe for the benefit of those who are not as engaged on this topic. Perry, can you talk about those other solutions of what might be able to address some of these issues and what CAISO is doing on those fronts?
I'm going to jump in. Just one quick clarification. So I guess my point was, if we find ourselves in that path of we are going to implement something, I'm not convinced that we're there yet, but if we find ourselves in that path, that's when you really need to make sure that we're not suppressing prices during tight supply conditions.
Right. So this is Perry. So the kind of the textbook way to really cut to the heart of market power would be to have load-serving entities engaging in more fixed-price forward energy contracts. So we've put that out there as one potential solution that really cuts to the root cause rather than doing a mitigation after the fact. And I don't want to speak for the MSC, but it seemed that at their last meeting, there was a presentation that was sort of weighing, well, if you mitigate, don't you further decrease the incentive to engage in contract? So there's that decision to make. Bilateral procurement of additional resources to increase supply during our net load peak. If our forward capacity procurement is not getting resources in these hours that you saw us failing the test, you're just closer to the line of what Callie's saying of falling just below the threshold to fail the RSI, in which case the RSI would indicate a potentially uncompetitive condition. And then the last of those would be this system level, some kind of system or BA level market power mitigation in the ISO market. But yeah, those are the options. And I think Callie pointed out that you potentially may need to pair anything you do with system market power mitigation with some kind of enhanced scarcity pricing provision so that you nullify that incentive to bid cost.
I guess just a follow-up on that. I think it's unclear to me the path forward as far as truly identifying what the root causes are, and when you look at these different solutions, what targets those and addresses those most effectively. It seems that we're moving forward with a discussion on system market power, and it's almost concluded already that we're going down that path. I know that decision hasn't been made, but some of these other alternatives maybe are not getting as much airtime. So I think from a participating stakeholder, it just seems like maybe we could focus the discussion on all of the alternatives being proposed and how they might address the issue, not just system market power.
So Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. My organization is very concerned about consumer protection, so this is really that's really the issue here. But I have to say, after, I have a fair bit of interest in this subject, and I've read a fair bit about it, looked at actual data, and, it's difficult for those of us who are not directly doing this kind of market monitoring and analysis or run a trading desk or other, similar kinds of things, or, to really assess, to assess how we should even think about this issue, because the issues you've identified here, this is kind of a where there's smoke, there might be fire kind of approach. You have to identify patterns that could lead to actual market power, and the ISO has been the subject of market power attacks. FERC has come in with, oversight and correction, I guess you could argue, and penalties and so forth, some pretty high-profile cases. So we know that there is that potential. I think my own observation personally is it appears to me that FERC and the ISO have both taken this very seriously, and the ISO and the DMM have really, put their shoulder to the wheel and really tried to work through all of this. But these issues keep coming up. And as more or less of an outsider, I look at what happens in the real time, and I just have to scratch my head a lot of the time. So I was looking at the data for last week. I use the Energy Online website, LCG. Some of you know them, put it up. It's easier, believe me, than trying to go directly to the CAISO Oasis for this data, but I'm presuming their data is accurate. So last week, the real time varied between maybe 15 and 60 bucks for most of the week, except for 3 intervals right after midnight on August 19th, when the price went to above 900 bucks, and then promptly fell back to where it was. And I'm looking at those things, and I had been looking at those things for several years, and I asked somebody who's known in this region as an economist, I won't give a name, what this all meant and why this kind of not really random pattern, but sort of difficult to figure out pattern of $1,000 spikes happening several times a week in the ISO and the real time was happening. He says, oh, that's just the market telling us things. And I'm like, but what things is it telling us? The observing the actual patterns in the pricing has some very interesting aspects to it. And when you talk about scarcity pricing, I understand the theory of that, but I'm wondering what does that really mean? And to what degree does it reflect market power as we would construct that concept conventionally versus everybody waiting for an opportunity and then taking it when they can?
Thanks, Fred. That's a good comment to transition to Jeff Spires from PowerX to kind of give some additional thoughts about this issue and what it is and maybe what it isn't.
Thanks, Therese. Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Spires of PowerX. I appreciate the opportunity to provide our perspective on this topic. I also appreciate Perry's data and the analysis that he was providing earlier, because I think from our perspective, before we move forward with potential solutions, we really have to make sure that we thoroughly understand what are some of the potential drivers of elevated prices in the CAISO BA. For example, are elevated prices stemming from a resource adequacy shortfall? I think that there is now conclusive evidence that California RA supply falls short of the CAISO's needs by multiple thousands of megawatts during peak hours. And we very much appreciate that the CAISO and the CPUC are working towards making the much needed improvements in the resource adequacy program to address those gaps. And, you know, in addition to that, there has been some concerns raised about whether or not there is insufficient forward hedging and long-term contracting. But we really think that the critical first step here is to address these large resource adequacy concerns. Not only does that lead to reliability, but it's also helping to promote a competitive marketplace and competitive outcomes. A second question that we've already been discussing today is there scarcity in the CAISO BA? In which case you would expect that prices would rise above short-run marginal costs as new supply is needed to meet load. And I think, you know, one of the things we've been thinking about on this topic is some of the comments during the discussions at the workshop and in the written comments have focused on a sort of narrow definition of what does scarcity mean based on a more traditional method of looking at load and operating reserves being contingency reserve regulation. But in the dam enhancements initiatives, one of the other elements and one of the key drivers of that initiative is that the CAISO now needs additional balancing reserves of upwards of 2,500 megawatts in peak hours to meet day-ahead uncertainty, as well as to manage the anticipated ramping needs in real time. And so if you were to look at those same measures that Perry was showing on one of his slides about whether or not there's sufficient supply to meet load, if you're to take that analysis and adjust and recognize that there's another 2,500 megawatts of supply that the CAISO typically is looking for, currently relying on out-of-market actions to seek that supply. So if you were to add that need into the analysis, I think your conclusions on whether or not scarcity is occurring would be much different. And so in our mind, there really is scarcity conditions occurring in many of these hours, regardless of, you know, whether the traditional metrics fall below the line or not. Lastly, I think the question that we've been talking about is there a concern of market power in the CAISO BA? Our view is that the analysis is not conclusive that there is a current presence of market power in the CAISO BA, and we'll get into some of the reasons for that. But we do recognize that that could change over time. As the CAISO sees its grid tightening, there is the potential for an increased reliance on imports, and so conceivably there could be a time in the future where the CAISO is import constrained, and the potential for evaluating competitive conditions in the CAISO BA is appropriate. And so, we do support having this dialogue, but again, we just need to be very careful about looking at the data and considering what the drivers are of some of the outcomes to make sure that we're not jumping potentially to the wrong conclusion. So to that end, we took a look at some of the specific dates that were talked about at the last MSC meeting as part of Dr. Scott Harvey's presentation. They include the 20 hours that Perry was referring to, where priced cost markups were potentially greater than $20, as well as a handful of other hours from 2018 where LMPs were high, I think greater than about $500. And so the data that we're comparing here on these charts is the 16-hour bilateral prices at Mid-C and at Palo Verde, so the day-ahead on-peak indices at those two locations, compared to the 16-hour average LMPs in the CAISO market on those days. So the left graph, that dotted blue line, is the Mid-C day-ahead index across those 10 days. The red line is the 16-hour average LMP for deliveries to Cobb, and the lighter line is the 16-hour average at NP. Similarly, on the right side, the dotted green line is the bilateral price at Palo, and the red and pinkish are the Palo and SP15 16-hour average LMPs, respectively. So why are we looking at 16-hour? I think Callie referred to this, but I'll just say it again to make sure that it's clear. The majority of the bilateral trading in the day-ahead market occurs in 16-hour blocks on a non-peak basis. And so really have to recognize that when an external resource is making determinations about which market to sell to, it has to trade off selling its supply on a 16-hour basis at, say, Mid-C or at Palo Verde versus not making that sale for that 16-hour block and instead saving that supply to offer it into the CAISO. And so really, when we want to make sure we're comparing apples to apples, we want to make sure we recognize that even in situations where one or two or a handful of hours in the CAISO are greater than the day-ahead index, like Callie mentioned before, the trade-off really is, do I forego selling 16 hours versus holding off to sell a handful of hours to the CAISO? And so really think that looking at the 16-hour opportunities is the most appropriate to understand what's going on in the CAISO and how that is contrasted with the outcomes in other markets. So there's really two major conclusions or two key points that I want to make on this slide. The first one is that this data really suggests competitive outcomes. These prices that we see are consistent with a well-functioning marketplace across the West. Not only are the CAISO prices consistent with the bilaterals, but in many cases, the CAISO prices are actually below the Palo and Mid-C bilateral prices. And I think this is, again, where I would emphasize some of the comments that were made earlier about the RSI metric and one of the critical flaws here, which is the RSI metric is not capturing the potentially large pool of supply that could be made available to the CAISO if the prices were attractive. And so we really have to remember that these bilateral trading opportunities occur before bids are submitted to the day-ahead market. And so if I'm an external resource and I sell my supply to Mid-C because that's where I think that the most attractive price is, I'm going to make that transaction. The buyer perhaps won't start a higher cost unit. We will e-tag that deal, and that is done. I don't submit that supply into the day-ahead market several hours later. It never shows up. And so when you have the RSI metric, it doesn't recognize that had the expectation been that the CAISO price would have been more attractive, then that supply will materialize. And so I think the question really becomes, in an environment where you've got a tightening grid and you're trying to attract supply and compete with these external markets, what would the impact be if you take measures that lower the price further below these other markets? I think that's really fundamentally the question. On the next slide, I think I just wanted to take a step back here to think a little bit more broadly about the competitive outcomes that we're looking for, especially in the context of an increasingly tightening grid in the CAISO BA. A lot of this discussion has been relatively narrow, talking about the risks of elevated prices in the spot market in a handful of hours. But this is really in contrast to the overall trend, which is that the overall market revenues are well below what is required to support new supply entering the market. And so the graphic on the left is just a recreation of some of the data that DMM regularly provides, the black line along the top being an estimate of the annualized fixed cost of a combined cycle resource, so about $166 per kilowatt year. And the green bars towards the bottom show the range of revenues of a hypothetical resource participating in the CAISO day-ahead and real-time markets. And so as you can see, there's a very large gap between that range of potential spot market revenues and what would be needed for a resource to recover its fixed costs. And that gap is sometimes referred to as the missing money problem. And really what it means is that in order for that supply to come to the market, it needs to find other revenue streams through RA payments or other long-term contracts to try to fill that gap. It's not great to see in the room here, but I added in light gray, and it really goes to the top of that arrow there, the CAISO's capacity backstop mechanism. If you were to receive the annual soft offer cap of about $76 per kilowatt year, that's just an indicator of, even if you received basically RA revenue that was at the cap for the CAISO's backstop mechanism, you still would fall short of meeting the annualized fixed cost of a resource. And I think that typical RA contracts fall well short of that CPM soft offer cap. So it's just to try to illustrate some of the challenges. So the point in here just to be that as we discuss some of these topics and methods to try to prevent or to mitigate the potential for market power in the CAISO BA, we do need to make sure that we're balanced with considering a broader look at what are the efficient market outcomes that we're really trying to accomplish. Because I think the risk is of making a fundamental mistake with applying mitigation inappropriately can really lead to problems. One, if you just shift down the green bars further, you could inevitably making this missing money problem worse and have difficulties attracting new supply when it's most needed. Second, I think some of the risks that have been talked about are basically scaring away external supply, which then means that your short-term markets are potentially having to look to more efficient units in state, or potentially having to select emitting resources versus clean resources. So there's inefficiencies in the market if you're not attracting all the potential supply that you should be. And lastly, there's a potential for indirectly increasing cost to the RA program, because there's been some talk of say limiting mitigation to RA imports. But I think the bottom line is, back to my previous slide with the prices, if you have mitigation that is forcing RA contracts to offer below their opportunity costs, that is a real cost that they will inevitably end up factoring into what they're willing to sell RA at in the first place. So I think we have to be cautious that we want to get this right because it can manifest itself even indirectly through other programs if we get mitigation wrong. And lastly, I think Perry made a comment along these lines. We do think that to the extent we're looking at this type of improved market power mitigation for CAISO, it would be valuable to consider other improvements or enhancements such as improving the scarcity pricing provisions, because then we're seeking adequate protection against inappropriate outcomes, but we're also allowing for prices to rise when necessary in an orderly fashion, in a transparent way that people understand, and that can really lead to efficiency and the appropriate price signals that I think we're all ultimately interested in. Last slide. What are some potential ideas? I think, first of all, like I said before, we're supportive of the dialogue on this topic, and we do want to provide constructive thoughts on ways to try to address legitimate concerns of the potential for market power in the CAISO BA. But that said, I want to start with just highlighting some of the challenges of the dialogue to date that we've heard in the context of a more broad system market power mitigation framework. One is, what is the trigger or the circumstance that raises market power concerns? So as we mentioned before, relying on an RSI metric or an RSI trigger really is excluding potential supply that could be offered into the CAISO market, but may not be because the price signals elsewhere are more attractive. The other challenge we really see there is that the resources being mitigated would potentially apply not only to the resources in the CAISO BA, but extend beyond the CAISO BA to external resources throughout the West. And that effect really on voluntary supply is that it discourages it from participating in the first place. And we just think that that's a harmful outcome and really counter to the needs of the CAISO BA. And I think the last point on the challenges we see here in terms of the extent of mitigation really is what is summarizing the challenges we've heard on some of the proposals to date, which is it seems as though some of the entities are basically proposing that the CAISO mitigate the West. And so in our view, this is problematic. You know, it seems to be, in essence, suggesting that the CAISO override voluntary offers throughout the West, mitigate supply, and do so to the benefit of purchasers in California. And I think that that's obviously not something that's particularly palatable for external resources, but I also want to add that it's really something that's unheard of. And we just think that it's really going to be counterproductive to go down that road for the reasons we've talked about, really that it's not promoting competition, it's not promoting additional supply, and it's really just, we think, leading to harmful and unintended consequences. But like I said, we do want to participate in a meaningful way and are looking at ways to try to address legitimate needs. And one of the methods that we've been thinking about to potentially address BA level mitigation is really to apply something similar to what all the other BAs in the EIM face participating in the EIM, as Perry mentioned, which is if the CAISO BA is import constrained, and perhaps you can apply that at a zonal level as well, NP15 or SB15. But if they are import constrained, and so they no longer have access to the competitive supply outside of the CAISO BA, then you can perform a three pivotal supplier RSI type metric. And if you find that there's a risk of mitigation, well then perhaps there is an avenue for a BA level mitigation measure at that point. And some of the benefits of pursuing that, in our view, is that it's really getting at applying mitigation only to the resources that are within the CAISO BA that are actually now the ones capable in that constrained area of meeting the load in the CAISO BA, which is exactly how the EIM mitigation is applied. But it also ensures that to the extent that the CAISO isn't import constrained, it still allows the CAISO prices to appropriately rise as needed to attract additional supply from those external markets. And so, we think that this approach is something that can address some of the concerns that have been raised about potential for elevated offer prices in the Cal ISO BA, but also ensure that the approach that's employed is only triggered under the right conditions, only applied to the right resources, and ultimately ensuring that we still maintain that competitive price signal. So that's all I had. I'd be happy to take questions.
Tony.
Hey, Jeff, Tony Braun.
Right.
Going back to your slide with the external ICE points, help me understand as a layperson what's the chicken and what's the egg there. So how do you reach the conclusion that that reflects competitive outcomes, since my intuition would tell me that those things would always somewhat track each other?
I think if the concern is that the CAISO prices in the CAISO BA are elevated relative to the competitive marketplace, what I'm showing here is that the CAISO prices are consistent with and often below the competitive prices that are occurring on those days. And so what we're looking at is we have high loads across the West, prices are trading, or energy is trading at elevated prices more generally, and the CAISO prices are following those economic signals to attract supply when needed.
Given the interconnected nature of these markets, aren't they always going to be somewhat similar? And so don't you get yourself in a circular reasoning point if you try to conclude somehow that, that the fact that the directional indications of the points on the graph are the same means that things are working okay?
Well, I think the starting point is that the West is competitive. I think that's really the critical piece, is if you're looking at the market prices at Mid-C and Palo, which are highly liquid, there's many buyers, there's many sellers, and these are the price signals that the resources are receiving for where to sell their supply, then the CAISO market, yes, it's following those prices, but we think that that's appropriate because they are competing directly with those other markets for that supply. I think if you saw a different scenario where the CAISO prices were rising well above these other markets, that's where you would potentially ask questions. But in what we're seeing here is the CAISO prices are consistent with those other markets that have many willing buyers, many willing sellers, are deemed to be competitive. And so, we think this is indicative of competitive outcomes and trading across those regions.
Hey, Jeff, this is Perry. We had the question earlier about whether we saw binding constraints in these hours where we failed the RSI. I think when I referred to Jeff's slide, I was thinking about this slide here. And if I just compared the NP, LMP to the mid-C, you see it tracks fairly well. I would guess that we didn't have a binding constraint between us and mid-C in the hour represented in this chart here. So what this means is that we were, price converged with the presumably competitive Western supply in this. Now, if I saw these prices diverge, I could say, oh, well, maybe our area was an uncompetitive area. We have an inflated price compared to the West, unless then we were converged to the Palo price and we were not binding to Palo. So this gives some indication. It's not the underlying data to what's binding or not, but seeing the prices this close, I would guess we don't have a binding intertie constraint between NP and mid-C.
Yeah, hi, Alan Combs with Energy GPS. So actually, to ask this really just as a clarification. So on this slide, does the NP15 price strip out the carbon component in California? Because usually when I do comparisons to external markets, we assume the NP15 price has a carbon component.
That's a good question, but no, these are just the straight LMPs at COB and NP, so we didn't make adjustments for the carbon component, nor did we adjust for losses, but I think some of those nuances are details that probably wouldn't, or I can say confidently wouldn't change the general conclusions.
Actually, might help your case a little bit. That was my question. Thank you.
Any other questions for Jeff?
So this is Fred again, asking your indulgence. I'm going to make a slight correction to what I said before and then ask a question about the presentation here. I mentioned before that last week prices in the real time had gone way up after midnight on the 19th. I made the classic Excel mistake. I'm sure you've never done this, of sorting the price column and not noticing I hadn't sorted the date column. But I have looked at previous data, and we do see those price excursions at all hours of the day. I pulled a week out of March, more or less at random, and you get them at 8 a.m., 1 p.m., 5 p.m., 2 a.m., you know. So that, but just to correct the record, in case anybody checked. On this, I would first note that this isn't actually very, I haven't, I'm going to go back and look at Scott Harvey's presentation, but one thing to note about this particular time span is that this is when we had the big system stress last summer. The big heat wave that hit California and actually the whole West, late July, July 23rd, 24th, when for various reasons gas prices at SoCal Citygate went up to $40, and you know the California market mid-sea all rose as we see. I mean, it's an interesting time to look at because these are the stress conditions under which you want to, see how the system performs, how the pricing process works to help optimize dispatch. So I think it's a good example for that. But I'd be interested in looking at the variations between the different major pricing points over a longer period of time, or using different kinds of seasonal conditions to see whether these relationships more or less pertain, because this is a very unusual period.
Thanks, Fred. Okay, we're going to hear from Partha from PG&E, and he's in the enviable position of going last. Now he gets to comment on it, what everybody else has said, right? But he's also in the unenviable position of being between you and the reception. So I know you'll all give him your due attention until 5 o'clock, if that's how long it goes, right?
I only have till 5. I had an hour and a half presentation, so I'll try to cut back. But I really appreciate the CAISO, first of all, for your leadership in this area. I mean, I recognize that sort of the issues that have been discussed here. It's a complex topic, and I think one of the key messages that we've been sort of sending sort of from the beginning is that, in effect, there really needs to be sort of ample time to consider sort of what these different options are, both from when to mitigate and how to mitigate. At least the discussion that's had from my colleagues at PowerX and from WPTF sort of indicated, well, here's some issues associated with if we really do it wrong. And so that's sort of the first thing I sort of would highlight is that one of our key positions is sort of, in effect, let's get ahead of this. So all the data that we've seen indicates this could be a larger issue in the future. And so by basically looking at this now, by considering what the different alternatives are and the pros and cons of those alternatives, we really can have a good proposal that will hopefully mitigate the impacts that folks are indicating could occur. So really I have 3 main points I'm going to try to explain. But my first point is the data we've looked at, as well as the data analysis that was provided by the DMM and by the CAISO, really indicate that economic withholding looks like it has been an issue in the past, particularly in 2017 and 2018. Some of the data they provide is particularly associated with net sellers in the market and sort of the different bidding patterns associated with that. So I'll focus a little bit on sort of what we're seeing in the market data. The second point I'm hoping to basically make clear is that we really see this issue as likely to only get worse in the future. So that what we see in 2017, 2018 likely be worse, and that basically all the information provided from the CAISO, from the DMM indicates this could be a bigger problem. And so then the last point I'm hoping to address is really that I'm hoping that we can work on developing solutions that effectively mitigate market power without having some of the undue consequences discussed here. So these are very small charts. So I'll focus particularly on the one on the left first. So this is a graph that
Parsa, can I interrupt you for a second and just be sure to speak into the microphone for the folks on the phone?
I appreciate. I'll go to the microphone. So the graph on the left, what this really is showing is this is a graph that the Department of Market Monitoring produced. And sort of the key thing that they did, they had two graphs. I just included this one here. This is the graph associated with net sellers in the CAISO market. I believe this is July 24th, 2018 in hour 20. And really what they're sort of showing is they had two graphs. One of them is associated with basically entities that were not net sellers, and then they had net sellers, and what were sort of the different bidding patterns you'd see between the two. What they really were showing was, this is one example day, but that in effect the bidding pattern from net sellers, particularly when there are tight system conditions. And when I say tight, I don't mean scarcity conditions, but just when in effect there are potentially, when it is getting close to scarcity, participants who are net sellers are likely to bid differently in the market, and that's what they're other data. And so we've done our own analysis internally and had sort of similar sort of conclusions where we don't have quite the transparency and ability to construct these curves that the EIM has. But when we look at sort of different times when we have high heat rates and the system looks tight, we have sort of similar questions in terms of basically why is the bidding patterns changing over time. And that really kind of gets to our second graph on the right. And what the graph on the right, the upper right is getting at is, really it's a plot comparing heat rates and the amount of internal thermal generation we're seeing in the month of July by year. And so this is comparing 2016, 2017, and 2018. And sort of all things equal, if you're sort of accounting for outages and you're accounting for basically retirements of thermal generation, you really would expect to see sort of a consistent relationship between the market implied heat rate and the amount of thermal generation you're seeing in the market. But what we're seeing sort of particularly in 2017, 2018 was sort of a sharp decrease from that relationship where for a given level of thermal generation, for a given market heat rate, there would be a whole lot less thermal generation internal to CAISO that we're actually seeing in the market. And so this is one more indication was that maybe the market is becoming less competitive, maybe market power is being exercised, and that we should get into this further. And the table at the bottom is really what we're getting at, sort of what was the impact to our to customers in California. And we calculated basically, we did sort of a rough estimate. We've asked the Department of Market Monitoring sort of on an ongoing basis. The Department of Market Monitoring indicated they might be able to provide this type of analysis to market participants so there's more clarity around it. This is sort of our calculation in terms of the excess rent associated with market power in 2017 and 2018. So I guess the next thing I'll really get is for my second point in terms of why is this likely to get worse. Several of my colleagues have indicated sort of some of the reports have come out in the IRP as well as some of the CAISO's own studies indicating that, in effect, in future years, there's been various studies showing there might be a 2,000 megawatt deficiency that needs to be made up in RA, going up to sort of, I think it was around 4,700 in 2022 was like the CAISO's most recent analysis of this. The second thing I'd point to is the CAISO, even in their summer assessment this year, one thing that they highlighted in their summer assessment, they did a sensitivity analysis. They described it as a low hydro sensitivity analysis. They basically took the 2018 hydro profile, which is basically 51% of the average snowpack. They had other assumptions such as 1 in 10 loads in the Southwest, as well as BPA hydro. I think was around 93% on this. And what they showed was there was basically a 26% chance of a stage 3 emergency and up to a 6%. And sort of one of the key takeaways that we had, and the DMM have highlighted in the report, is that for every hour of tight supply that we see, there's likely many, many more hours where there's market power available, where entities are likely to have the ability and incentive to be able to withhold capacity or economically bid high in order to drive those prices high. And so that's really why we think that this is a really important topic to get ahead of and to develop what those solutions are. The DMM, just in case you want to go read it, in their comments they listed basically 9 different factors in terms of what the drivers are. The tight supply was one of them. They had 9 others, including sort of the increased tolling arrangements, increased number of net sellers in the market. So there really was sort of a variety of reasons on top of sort of the change in supply-demand portfolio as a whole. And so I think that those are ones that we were wanting to highlight. And so, like, I think what we're really getting at next is sort of what are the options at hand. And I really don't want at this point really presuppose what the correct mitigation options are. I really do think that the discussions that have happened to date really highlight that market participants are really bringing good questions and bring good alternatives. Like to date, at least if I look at some of the key questions, is sort of under what conditions should we mitigate? Should CAISO mitigate just internal generation and RA imports? Is there a way to basically effectively mitigate imports from non-RA resources? What type of adders might we need to accommodate use-limited resources and opportunity costs? Are additional processes needed with the Department of Market Monitoring where you can go and basically request a sort of a separate mitigation measures outside? And so to me, those dialogues are really critical in developing sort of an effective strategy. And yeah, I really appreciate the CAISO's effort in sort of bringing this issue to light and to highlight sort of key options to address it. And at least maybe my final point is I think a lot of people are highlighting there's a bunch of different things that need to get solved, and so we shouldn't address system market power. We should do RA first. We should do rules on imports first. And to me, I'm not trying to. I think that those are important issues and issues that need to have focus on it, but it doesn't change the need to also look at alternatives. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Quick question, Nicholas Garcia from Mufuda. I'm looking at your statement that says energy prices reflect marginal cost of incremental energy, and I understand that from a straight economic perspective. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. But I would point out that, at least in Washington State, public policy is going to change when resources are dispatched. It's going to be much more difficult to dispatch thermal resources for economic purposes, and much more likely they'll be dispatched simply for reliability purposes, which will reduce the number of hours that are dispatched. So I guess the question I have for you and for the whole panel to opine on is, how do you deal with market power when the decisions for dispatch are being driven as much by public policy as they are by economics?
I think he said for the whole panel.
I'll just say, this is Perry. What Partha has on his slide here is not wrong. Energy prices should reflect marginal cost of incremental energy. That's what I think is considered a just and reasonable rate. So I'm not sure of this example where we would not use a gas plant when it's economic. That seems like withholding. So I don't know how to comment on that.
But what about when Nicholas Garcia again. What about when public policy is saying, hey, you could only use a gas plant when you're doing it for reliability purposes, not for economics?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a great example to address the exact issue. I mean, obviously, in California, in effect, if there is a adder associated with GHG cost, that would be sort of a part of how mitigation would apply and how people would look at that. I'm not sure how to look at sort of that example where if there was actually a rule that said you cannot dispatch this unit until X, it might be sort of similar sort of measures in the market that would sort of not mitigate those units earlier. But I think that's
I'll just, Nicholas Garcia one last time, and I'll just point out that Washington State has a new law that basically is directing utilities over time to move to 100% renewable. They do have an exemption for reliability, and they have a couple others as well, but they have exemption for reliability. So my point is that if you're having to recover your fixed operating costs over 1/10 the number of hours or 1/100th of the number of hours you would otherwise operate, you're going to have to recover a significant, you're going to have high prices in order to recover those costs. And I just don't know how you can do that and have your energy prices reflect marginal cost of incremental production.
So this is Callie Wells for WPTF. So just kind of on your initial question, kind of what came to mind is in California, that's what was referred to as exceptional dispatches. So in my mind, that's when a resource would only be dispatched for reliability purposes outside of, just the economics alone. And in that case, they have their own settlement implications, and it's not necessarily that they set the prices in California always. So I think when you're talking about dispatching for reliability outside of economics, we have a whole out-of-market action, and they have their own settlement.
This is Tony Braun. I think as we continue this discussion, it might be a couple things. One, I think sometimes it's presented in a way that the energy prices that are reflected in any of the market intervals that we're talking about are intended to collect the full costs of the resources. And I don't think that that's an accurate assumption. And nor are they intended to provide price signals for new generation. And so they're an efficiency tool. So I think that when we approach some of these issues from that perspective, we end up going down paths that are incorrect. The other thing, I think it highlights the importance of the webinar and the comments that we're going to get on the GHG, because one of the reasons I think we started talking about some of these GHG issues is because some of the pitfalls that other states that have gone down this road have run into, where the states have gone down paths of trying to not provide targets, but say, you got to meet this reduction by this time, this reduction by a different date, but start getting into the dispatch of the resources that are in the state, then we start getting into thorny legal questions about whether that's permissible state regulation. I think it's really complicated, and at some point in time when we get all the comments in, we might want to go down the path of, exploring some of these things more further as the state regulations evolve.
Any questions on the phone for the panel, Partha or the panel?
There are currently no questions in the queue.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room?
I have one question. Steve Kearns from Bonneville Power. Would you mind going back to the previous slide real quick? I want to explore a little bit on how you determine what a non-competitive hour is in this analysis. And it looks like from the footnote that a non-competitive hour were counted as a day-ahead interval in which the implied heat rate was greater than 20 and the amount of thermal generation was less than 25,000. So why is 25,000 megawatts there? Why is that important? And I assume that refers to ISO.
Yeah, I think it was important mainly because it was an amount that we'd sort of seen in the market previously in terms of the amount of thermal.
But it's an arbitrary number.
I wouldn't describe it as arbitrary as much as it was an amount that could show up. If you look at the 2016 blue, roughly 2,000, 25,000 with the survey market applied heat rate of roughly 7.
And I think you also said you accounted for outages and retirements also?
This wasn't normalized completely for outages and retirements. That is sort of an issue, but when we looked at this, it was really more of meant to be an example of why we think more digging needs to be happening. And that was really, when we're doing that, was more trying to understand what sort of the rough magnitude of what these impacts could be. And so we recognize that a better, more complete analysis could likely have a more accurate the impacts were.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. And one other quick question. I think when you were talking a little bit later, you asserted that, and correct me if I got it wrong, but what I thought I heard was that you suggested that having high prices as related to having supply shortages will manifest itself in other hours as people withholding. Is there any evidence that that's really happening?
I think what we're seeing in these graphs above is sort of what we'd say is the evidence that we have that people are, in effect, participants are likely, particularly net sellers, are bidding high when system conditions are tight. EIM has provided sort of various analyses around that in their annual report. I think that's sort of part of what we're wanting to dig in here is sort of with the frequency of this and sort of how we mitigate different instances that might occur.
So some of these hours would be non-tight hours is what you're getting at.
Some of these hours could be, they could be.
Okay. Yeah, hi, Alan Combs with Energy GPS. I'm cognizant of the hour, but I am thinking of when people talk about solutions to apparent market power, besides coming up with default energy bids, which have been mentioned. I mean, PowerX has mentioned it, and so did PG&E. Other measures come up like, an administratively determined measure of scarcity, like a operating reserve demand curve. And before anybody, says we're not Texas, other markets have it. PJM, I think New England has it too. So is that, really my question is that being discussed as another tool to, if you take scarcity out of the bid, out of the voluntary bid, and can you put it back in through an operating reserve demand curve price adder?
Yeah, we talked about this is Perry. We talked about at the last working group how if we were going to go down the route of creating a system market power mitigation scheme, we would have to take a hard look at our scarcity pricing rules and potentially at an ORD.
Just to clarify, there are no scarcity price. I mean, scarcity pricing is, you allow bid-based subject to mitigation, so you get $10 adder. Maybe you get an exception for special gas prices, but they're in the form of DEB components. There's not a ORDC in California today.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Laura.
I guess I have the last question. Real quick, so is the concern both real-time and day-ahead? It's a two-part question.
The study only looked at the day-ahead market.
Because I think Therese had asked the question earlier, what would be the impact of a system market power mitigation process for the EIM? So then is there anything we should be thinking about for EDAM? If EDAM moves forward, are there any impacts to EDAM?
So, yeah, this kind of add to what I said before about the analysis only looking at the day ahead. If we were to go down a road of creating a system market power mitigation, it would make only sense to apply it to the spot market real time, and then so that then market power couldn't just shift from the day ahead market into the real time market. So I think that there's a key design question of do you need it in both the real time market and the day ahead market, and we're that design decision. As it relates to real time market, if we were to just put it in the real-time market, I think I talked about on my one slide how that would affect the competitive LMP, which then could affect the mitigation level of in EIM balancing authority areas. The other path is if you have it in the day ahead, then what does that do for EDAM design? And we haven't looked at that yet.
Great. Can we maybe, while we're wrapping up, go back to the slide if it has the dates, or maybe, Perry, you could just remind everybody what's the status of this? What are the next steps on this issue? If people, their curiosity was piqued on this and they want to be sure that they can track it going forward, what are the next steps?
If people are actually curious about this topic, Seeing the faces in the room, I don't think many people are, but we have had good discussion here. We're planning a working group in September, no date on that yet, and then there will be a market surveillance committee meeting in October. I believe it's October 11th, but you can check the market surveillance committee webpage off of the CAISO.com webpage. And then after that, I believe there will be another market surveillance committee call to adopt their opinion, which then they'll give to the CAISO Board of Governors in November.
Terrific.
Those are the next steps.
Thank you so much. Okay, so a couple of closing things. Most important, the reception, for those of you that are here in the room, is at Altabira, which is at 1021 Northeast Grand. It's about 5 blocks down this road. Just follow the tracks, the MAX train or the light rail, whatever you call it, about 5 blocks that way. It's on the top floor, 1021 Northeast Grand. The next Regional Issues Forum meeting will be Tuesday, December 3rd in Las Vegas. So go ahead, mark your calendar for that. And again, the EIM governing body meeting is tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., not here, but at the Marriott Courtyard downtown. Thanks so much for being here today. Thanks for those of you that joined on the phone, and we'll see you in December.